listeners, and welcome to another episode of No Priors. This week, we're joined by Alyssa Henry, who recently retired from being longtime CEO of Square within Block. Before that, she was the vice president of AWS, running, amongst other things, the storage products, or the digital storage bucket for the world. And before AWS, she ran order management software at Amazon and started her tech career at Microsoft. She remains on the boards of Intel and Confluent and was previously on the board of Unity. I'm a huge admirer of Alyssa's leadership. Welcome, Alyssa.
Great to be here.
Let us start by talking about Square. You led there for almost a decade through enormous growth. Was there a single moment that most defined your experience?
I don't know if there's a single moment that most defined, although there were a ton of different moments. Obviously, we were known as the Little White Reader Company and the Farmer Markets Payments Company when I joined. Cash App wasn't really a thing. Tidal wasn't even a thought. Crypto wasn't a thing. The Square business transformed from that Little White Reader into a much larger business, serving businesses of many, many different sizes, from still the smallest to also large stadiums and multinational companies. So the moment that really was, I don't know if it was most defining, but one of the I still tear up a little bit about it, is actually the day we IPO'd. And what was so exciting about that was, if you looked at the sign that was outside the New York Stock Exchange, it was covered with just the logos of all these small businesses, right? And the note was, the neighborhood is going public. And I think that really kind of sums up, just the mission-driven, purpose-driven organization that Square and Block is and was, and just the impact that the company has had on just countless small businesses, helping them, give them the tools and the technology that in many ways had only been previously available to, the likes of Amazon and Walmarts of the world.
It's funny. I was an early investor in Square, a small one. And then I worked at Twitter. So I worked with Jack in two very different contexts. The way that he ran the two businesses was radically different, right? I think it's everything from the org structure, where Square was always more sort of GM/business unit almost driven, versus Twitter, which was always sort of functionally oriented, or often functionally oriented. How did your career shift over time? Because I think you started off more on sort of platform and technology, and then you took over a big business area. And I'm a little bit curious about that evolution and how you went from being somebody who's done a variety of things, they're more product and engineering driven, to somebody who's really running a whole business area.
Well, my career's kind of gone back and forth between product and engineering, between functional leadership and general management leadership a couple of times over my several decades in tech. I started as an engineer and then moved into and engineering management, then back into IC as a product manager, and then into a general management type role at Microsoft, then back into a functional role when I moved to Amazon, then back into a general manager role with P&L, and then back into a functional role when I joined Square. So I've gone back and forth. I do like the general manager, the end-to-end, multi-discipline, multi-functional leadership roles. It just uses more parts of the brain. And as you get more senior and senior in leadership, the job becomes more and more about how you both instigate and resolve conflict in order to kind of keep things on the edge, like on that creativity and execution threshold. And the kind of those problems in terms of either generating or resolving conflict are just more interesting when they're multifunctional, multidimensional in nature, for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess like in the context of Square and its foray into AI, there's a set of areas that traditionally have been areas where payments companies have sort of applied ML, so that'd be things like fraud detection or other areas like that. Can you tell us a little bit about how that evolution occurred at Square and what areas you find most intriguing going forward?
Well, as you state, in financial services, application of machine learning has been key for a long period of time. And particularly if you look at a business like Square, where you've got millions of small customers, and it's not you don't really have a one-to-one relationship with the vast majority of your customers just because of the scale and the size of them. You really have to bring technology to bear in terms of understanding like a whole range of things, from who's a good actor and who's a bad actor, to who do you target for a specific product, who's going to be most likely to find, a marketing product useful or least likely to find it useful, or that sort of thing. So there's lots of internal applications, and have been for years, in terms of machine learning, manage risk, manage fraud, as well as to cross-sell and grow the business. And then more recently, even kind of prior to this kind of latest big shift in the AI landscape, we were using GPT-2 as part of the Square Messages product, being a virtual assistant to help customers answer responses to customer inquiries and a variety of things. But what's so exciting to me about kind of really how the landscape has changed and the technology advances in the last year are how much better the tools have gotten, and how much more broadly applicable they are in terms of bringing kind of expert assistance to a much larger audience, right? But it effectively unlocked the consumer and started to then show what this technology could do when then further integrated into domain specific areas. You go talk to small business owners, most of them will tell you, gosh, I know I should be doing marketing, right? Like I know if I was more effective in doing that and reaching out to my customers, I could drive more business. But I got to tell you, I work all day and then I come home at night and I got to take care of my family. And then it's 8 p.m. and I'm starting to think about, gosh, do I just chill for a minute, or, am I going to spend the next 3 hours trying to, create an image and write text for the campaign and everything like that? And what they tell you is, like, I know I should be doing this stuff, but it's just too hard and it takes too much time. And I'm not an expert. Like, I got into doing this because I love cupcakes, not because I like writing email marketing, right? And so what's exciting about all this technology, that's one example, but there's so many of these kind of different things where just the ease of use and the accessibility opens up what previously was effectively just massive white space, right? It was customers or people that, if it was easy enough to use, if it was accessible enough, if it was cheap enough, they go, yeah, that would be huge for me. But it wasn't accessible. It was too expensive. It was too hard to go find and hire a marketing consultant to do it for me, and the ROI wasn't there, and blah blah blah. So I think this the evolution that's occurring right now is exciting, in part just because of really the previously unaddressed demand that it's unlocking.
You've mentioned some really compelling ways that different SMBs can really use generative AI. And I think one of the things that is a little bit underdiscussed in the AI world is the impact of this technology, particularly generative AI, to e-commerce or other forms of commerce and fintech and other areas. Are there other areas that you think nobody's really addressed yet, or that are big opportunities in this space? Because, I mean, adopting GPT-2 was super early, right? You all use this technology before most people were aware that this was a big deal. And then to your point, there's some really interesting things that you've been doing in terms of merchant coaching and other areas that, I think are really fascinating. Are there big areas of e-commerce that you just think are going to be swept up in this technology that people aren't talking about enough?
Well, I think almost every aspect of kind of a small business, you can find applications, and some of it, the technology is not quite there yet, but is rapidly getting there in terms of some of the finance and numbers and quant pieces. Some of the quantitative hallucinations have been a little bit more than the others, but it's all rapidly going. And I think it's if you look at the largest e-commerce players, the Amazons and the Walmarts, right? Like, they've been investing heavily in this area. So, the larger e-commerce companies have definitely embraced. And frankly, in e-commerce in general, it's been for these retailers or for e-commerce retail platforms, because one of the things is if you're in e-commerce, basically everything's already digitized. So one of the difference between in-store commerce and particularly local commerce and e-commerce is the fact that just to operate in e-commerce, you have to digitize. You have to have images to show what your product is. You have to show you have to have compelling description of it. You have to track inventory. So there's a bunch of stuff that you have to have, which this is again some of the white space for small businesses, local business in particular, is the rate of digitization in store significantly lags the rate of digitization online. And it goes back to the fundamental problem of it's too either hard or expensive to effectively digitize. And again, this is where, really in kind of all aspects, I think the Gen AI is lowering making it 10x faster, 10x cheaper kind of thing, right? Squared launched a product a couple of years ago called Photo Studio, because we heard from businesses that they wanted to sell online, but they didn't have product photos, right? And so the first iteration of it is we actually had a physical photo studio in Brooklyn. and we had a 360 camera, and people would ship us their products, right? And we take what would look like professional grade photos for them, which was because we were addressing this blocker that so many of them had to getting online, right? But you fast forward, and we then evolved it into iPhone app that was using, again, less mature versions of, image detection and generation to use AI to remove backgrounds and things like that. Again, making it easier. You don't have to ship, reducing the cost. And now if you look at what you can achieve with some of the latest stuff, like the barriers come down even further. So it's incredible, kind of all of these different things, and then I'm talking about, on the kind of selling side, the revenue generation side. But I think there's a lot of back office as well too, from employee management and tools and communication to finances, predicting and understanding what your cash flow actually looks like and what is your top selling product and all these sorts of things, where a lot of the data is accessible. But again, most of these owners, they're not MBAs, right? The line is they got into business and they like working in their business, but not on their business. And so the business side of it is not the interesting part. It's the craft or the customer interaction or the hospitality of all those things. And so I think all of these advances that we're seeing are making it easier and will make it easier to operate with better expertise and less time and effort on the business side of the business.
There's so much there. I feel like one thing that's been a surprise to many tech people, business people, has been how much latent demand there is for content generation of different forms, right? In like every business context. I remember like a year ago with things like Midjourney or with Stable Diffusion, like, progressively better diffusion models. In general, there was a vein of like, oh, like that's cute and it's like a novelty, but really how many artists are there in the world and how many people are really interested in art for the sake of art? And you see it apply to everything from like product photography to being able to generate like short form or spokesperson video. And, the number of people, as you said, that want to avoid the camera, like, the professional studio in Brooklyn, or don't want to be on camera at all, or just want to do like really attractive product photography or marketing and sales videos at 1/100th and 1/1000th the cost is quite large, right? And so I think it's like really interesting to think about the demand categories here for these new capabilities, which like a lot of them don't feel like traditional software businesses.
Yeah, I think that's always been one of the amazing things about technology, and one of the things that I find just so compelling about our industry is that when you can increase ease of use and accessibility, you just unlock all this latent demand, this white space that exists, right? And you see it over and over again, right? Originally, who was the market for a word processor? Well, it's all the secretaries, right? Like they're the only ones that are going to. Now, everyone uses a word processor, right? The TAM just exploded, and even, taking the Square example, how many people could accept a credit card and take a payment, right? Like, but there were all these really small businesses that were completely underserved because it was too expensive and too hard, right? And, you make something better, cheaper, faster, and all of a sudden you unleash, all of this latent demand. And I think we're in the process of that with this technology in sort of multiple vectors. And so I think it is really going to reshape a lot of things. And it's not just as people like to talk about, oh, well, AI is going to take away jobs. It's like, yeah, well, maybe, but a lot of it is actually work that's not getting done that someone could get done, right? It's like sending that marketing campaign, or it's actually, putting together, a real logo, or it's, writing better copy that actually is compelling and descriptive, the things that just were never going to get done otherwise. And now they're getting done.
Yeah. Can I ask you to tell us the story of how you guys ended up playing with GPT-2 for, I think it was like customer, like merchant facing responses to begin with? Because we have other, Elad and I think each have other portfolio companies that were experimenting, but it was quite early. Like it didn't really work, or it took a lot of work to get something useful out from a just messaging perspective.
I would like to say it was maybe more strategic than it was, but Vinod Khosla was on our board for years, and he had a portfolio company that was being courted by another company to acquire them. And Vinod called me up and said, Alyssa, you should go talk to these guys and see if maybe like Square might be an interesting place for them. So I met the two founders, Stanford machine learning PhD folks, and they walked me through kind of what they were doing. It was slightly different context, but just got super excited about the potential there, as well as the two people on their team. And so we acquired that company in, I want to say 2018 or something, and put them to work on kind of stitching together but some of these customer facing experiences, leveraging some of the early work that they'd done. And because again, we just knew that, there was a real customer problem for Square merchants. Goal was to apply technology to make our merchant jobs easier and give them time back to focus on things that matter. So that team's still going strong and continue to expand the capabilities and obviously move further down the line in terms of models and whatnot.
So one more thing on Square, I feel like it'd be remiss in not asking you after the almost decade you were working there, like what else, even AI aside, do people not understand is changing in e-commerce right now? More of the same in digitization? Anything else you think like trends people should understand?
Digitization is a big one. And I'd say integration. It's even more so true in-person commerce versus e-commerce, but it's true in both places in that you go watch a business owner or their team kind of work, and you watch their workflows, right? And even the stuff that's digitized in many cases, what you see is they've got multiple browser windows open, and they're cutting and pasting from one tool into another tool, or they're downloading from this, and then they're emailing it to that. And like I think the workflows, even the ones that are digitized are not integrated. And then of course the ones that are manual and not digital, the integration is worse or non-existent. And so I think there's just a huge opportunity, and I think we'll see the next phase kind of evolve, in the same way that, in many industries and in many parts of tech, what you see is kind of best of breed early on, where different parts of the landscape are built out. But then ultimately what you see, it's this classic bundling and unbundling. Right now, a lot of the stuff is unbundled, and I think we're going to go into a bundling phase because it addresses a number of things. It addresses integration, and it also, you can typically offer a bundle, for less than the sum of the individual parts and that kind of thing. So I think we're going to see, from an industry perspective, kind of more aggregation and more bundling, because we've been through, when we went from in-person to e-commerce, a bunch of categories kind of got created, and we're going to see the consolidation and the bundling of categories and the blurring of lines between them.
I want to go back a little bit in your history. So you were previously at the forefront of the cloud revolution for a long time as the first GM for AWS storage. And, just beyond storage too, responsible for a huge number of innovations in computing that we all use now, S3, Glacier, Lambda, EBS. I'm missing some. How do you think about, like, there's a lot of discussion of AI changing the cloud services landscape. Like, do you see this as a new wave of computing?
Certainly there's a bunch of new aspects to it. Cloud computing historically, very, very CPU intensive, some GPU as well too, various use cases, but obviously, AI, just seeing an explosion in GPU based compute. Obviously there's tons of demand right now just for compute capacity, for training. It's not replacing existing workloads, it's adding new workloads, as people are figuring out how to then expand, companies like Square Block, figuring out then how to, how are we going to apply these technologies, and then where are we going to go do our training and whatnot. So I think it's an exciting time. One of the fun parts about being in technology is like you get these big shifts that happen. So it's never a dull moment. And I think the race is definitely heating up, and it's in many ways, I think it's a land grab, and lots of different players are figuring out how they go grab land.
One thing that's interesting about this wave is how monolithic the services are today. I think you can think of this as essentially year one or year two of having access to these large foundation model services, right? But the interfaces are really simple. It's not even you're just talking about bundling. It's like a single natural language call versus if you contrast that to the joke is you can't even keep track of like the Amazon services released. Right? Do you think we get a wealth of services over time, the way many services have emerged in cloud, or is just you lob in, more and more complicated prompts to a single model?
It's probably both. If you go back AWS at the beginning, right? S3 was sort of the first. SQS was actually technically the first, but S3 was really kind of the first service, and incredibly simple API. Right? 4 REST operators or something. What was compelling about it is it was so easy to use, right? And then obviously a whole bunch of stuff sprang up around it. S3 became not just, it was a first class service done right with direct customer relationships, but it became foundational as well for many of the other services that were built on top of it, right? So you go trace kind of the call stack, if you will, within most AWS services. Probably, I would argue, probably all of them. And you can go find S3 somewhere as a component of it. Take OpenAI, started relatively simple, but adding to stuff. In fact, making them ease of use. Actually, even though adding new capabilities, in some ways, adding functionality that makes call patterns even simpler, right? With threads and messages and some of these other things. And so I suspect we'll continue to see an evolution where we're going to get some more capabilities that extend some of the core foundational services. We're going to see work that makes using them continue to simplify things that can be simplified. And then I do think we're going to see, some specialization as well, some additional model. I mean, you're already seeing some of this today, right? If you look at, like the I call Amazon Bedrock, right? The aggregate service at some level, right? Where you can host and run all of these other different models. It's a single service, but it's kind of a bundle, if you will, of a variety of models. So, we'll see. It's usually some combination of both. And I agree with you. We're super early on right now.
If you look at the major cloud providers today, 2 of the 3 have major alignment with the underlying foundation model or foundation model company. So, for example, Google's, very publicly building out Gemini as sort of its next generation foundation model. OpenAI has close alignment with Microsoft. Do you think it matters whether or not Amazon has its own close paired foundation model, or do you think it's just there'll be a lot of open source models, will be integration with multiple third-party vendors? Like, does that alignment at all matter as we think about the future oligopoly world of the cloud providers?
Like I said, I think it's a land grab, and lots of people are trying to figure out what's going on. But Amazon has the Anthropic alignment and investment as well too, and so they're pretty close. Although I think Google just recently announced investment in Anthropic as well. I believe Microsoft is also, they've got the OpenAI, but they've also said, hey, we're doing some of our own stuff. So I think it's unclear how this is all going to shake out and who the winners are going to be. So I think everyone seems to be placing multiple bets from combination of I think it's going to be build by partner. It's probably all 3.
From an end customer perspective, that makes a lot of sense, because if you have an enterprise that's using your compute, there may be a variety of different models and approaches they want to take. And so it does seem like the monolithic world seems reasonably unlikely unless you're a model company worried about some competitive dynamic with the underlying cloud provider. But the flip side of it is all the cloud providers are also funding a lot of the different model companies. So that makes sense.
It's not just the cloud providers are funding them, but it's also, if you look at the marketplaces on the cloud providers, so like they have partnerships with all these people where to get down your Azure AWS bill, you say, I'm going to spend this many millions of dollars on your cloud. Some of it's going to be I'm using raw compute or storage or whatever, but a good chunk of it is also like I'm going to buy this third party partner through your app marketplace and use that to satisfy my quota of how much I pledged. So I think all of these models, business models, all intermesh.
Alyssa, I don't think you will remember this conversation, or I'd be surprised if you did, but I came to ask you a question maybe in your first year at Square about, I think it was like some Hadoop related thing. So this really dates this conversation now. But I was asking you about it, but it was some sort of like data infrastructure open source thing. And you just looked at me and you said, Sarah, Amazon loves open source. We make more money off open source than any of the open source companies do. Right. And I think first of all, that was like one of the most terrifying business conversations I've ever had. You were perfectly nice about it, but I was just like, oh my God, what am I doing these open source companies? She's right. This is terrible. What do you think happens in that landscape of like the open source models?
Well, there's certainly demand, there's strong customer demand for open source models, right? For enterprise demand for it, right? Because it's not, quote, black box. You theoretically could in-house it all if you wanted. So I think, anytime there's demand, the products will find a way into the marketplace. And anytime there's a passionate developer community who is interested both in sort of giving to the community, but also it's a way to make your name as as an engineer too, by participating in these projects and, being a core committer or whatnot. I think open source is going to continue to evolve. The question is where and how do you make money off of it? Obviously, there are some companies that, have done well taking open source, or some of the founders or, the project or whatever, and then, launching companies around it. I put Confluent with Kafka in that bucket. But yeah, there have been some others that have struggled. Hadoop was there for a while, but kind of never quite got the commercial piece working well. And I think just timing, not enough then differentiation relative to what the cloud providers could do, pick up and go out. And I think one of the things with the cloud providers too is because you have sort of default customer demand, you launch one of these services using the open source. In many cases, you'll have existing customers that want to use it, and so then you're immediately getting customer feedback, to help improve and tweak, and then help tweak it on your infrastructure. And I think that's the cat and mouse. But there's certainly customer demand for open source in general, and certainly open source AI models right now. And so I think we'll see both.
So the one other, really impressive association you have is being on the board of Intel. And there's obviously been a variety of different computation waves that have occurred over time, and it feels like every wave of technology has an underlying different sort of massive semiconductor company that emerges, right? And so we had Intel and AMD for the microcomputer revolution. We had ARM and Qualcomm as part of the mobile revolution. NVIDIA, I think, has really emerged as a big driver on the GPU side and sort of the AI revolution. How do you think about startups in the AI semiconductor space, and are there specific areas or paths that you think are most interesting or intriguing relative to those?
I think your observation is right about each kind of wave there being kind of a clear 1 and 2. Each wave there is also a 3 and a 4, and you can kind of go down there. But I think there are in semis, as in many industries, I do think there's the kind of a standard number 1, number 2 kind of market position, and it's really hard to be number 3 and you're dead if you're number 4. And so I do think right now there's still obviously NVIDIA is selling the most GPUs. That's fun. Yeah, that's driving a lot of AI. But I think there's still room. I don't think it's going to be a monopoly on the area. And I do think there will be a clear number 2. And right now there's opportunities for different companies that are I think running towards it and trying to take that position and then perhaps over time challenge number 1. We're kind of going through the standard thing where as you progress in each of these, the tooling goes up the stack. So you start to see some things where maybe things were more coded to the metal. You start to then, it shifts to tools, and that's part of what then creates an opportunity, for 1 and 2 and that kind of thing as well too.
That makes sense. Yeah, a lot of people talk about the defensibility of NVIDIA in part being due to CUDA and then some aspects of interconnect and things like that. The other thing that I hear sometimes people talk about is just as there was sort of this very positive dynamic in the Wintel world, Windows and Intel reinforcing each other. Maybe today that's kind of the GPU transformer world where GPUs are in part optimized now more and more for transformer-based workloads. And transformers are obviously have been optimized by large armies of people relative to GPU. And so you may also have a virtuous cycle through that on a relative basis as sort of a second driver on top of what you're saying in terms of that software stack being really relevant or important.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting for sure to watch that.
The two pieces have always kind of gone together, right? And, and it's a push and the pull on both sides. Certainly, having worked at Microsoft, in the 90s, right? You were very close with Intel at the time.
On the AI accelerator topic, it's really interesting. Like, I think the view of many of the AI semi startups is that actually GPUs, they're really good at matrix multiplication, but they're not specifically tuned to transformers architectures. But it's very hard to make long-term bets in AI right now with how quickly everything is changing. Like, even from an architectural perspective, I think people are talking about the limitations of the attention mechanisms that we have and experimenting on the research side with different architectures in a way that they were not 3 months ago. And if you had asked me, I'd be curious if there's like interesting survey data around this. We can look for it or ask researchers. But if you had asked me, how committed are people to transformers as the dominant architecture at the end of 2023, I'd say very committed. And I feel less confident about that today.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're in a phase of kind of rapid change, right? I love the Jeff Bezos quote, focus on things that, will not change, because, there's going to be so many, like trying to make a bet on things that, are not just fundamentally true. You're gambling at some level. What I think is interesting, a lot of this stuff though, is, again, technology often goes through these kind of cycles where what you see is, you see scale up architectures to a point, and then you reach some sort of a tipping point where you're not making as much process on sort of a scale up architecture, and so then you start to break it down, and you kind of scale out, and then it kind of anyway. So we've been through these curves multiple times. I think what's sort of interesting in the semi space, in many ways, it's been kind of a scale up model for years. And I think part of what's happening, and it's already underway, right? But you're starting to see, more of these chiplet designs, more use of advanced packaging, and it's really starting to look more like, in some ways, almost like a microservices architecture, whatever you draw the software analogy. But I think one of the reasons, kind of a system design architecture is interesting is because in some ways it allows you to predict it smaller, like you can tune and predict smaller components, and you can rip out and replace components rather than having to kind of change the whole thing. And so I think we're definitely moving towards more and more modular architectures, and I think that's going to give more and more flexibility, which then I think can help accelerate the innovation cycle as well.
It also feels like at this point of any innovation cycle, there's always a ton of experimentation that happens, and that happened, I think, on everything from social products to more recently with crypto, where there was all these different L1s that were invented to be sort of scalability alternatives to Ethereum, and then it moved into L2. And it just feels like every wave of computing, you suddenly have this burst of, well, this thing is really working. Let's try 5 other things that could work potentially better. And then, it feels like 90% of the time it collapses back to the original thing that you just keep scaling it or whatever, but we'll see. I guess,
Darwinism.
you've had this, Darwin selects for the thing that keeps going. So
Elad wants to bring back the monolith.
Yeah, I love code monoliths, and I really love, no, I'm just kidding. You've had, I think, one of the most impressive careers in technology in all sorts of different ways. You've been involved with some of the most important companies in the world. In literally every decade that you've operated, you've been at
Thank you.
The most or one of the most important companies. What's next? Like, how do you think about the next couple of years, the next decade?
I don't know. It's a good question. It's one I'm working on figuring out. My husband retired from work 2 years ago. And for the last 2 years, he's been like, Alyssa, come out and play with me. Come play with me. I'm like, I'm working. I like it. I'm working 78 hours a week, right? It's like, what are you doing, girl? So, and I'm like, well, so, I think obviously I love technology. I love deep technology. Square was super interesting. It was the highest up the stack I'd ever really worked. It was the first time ever working on, financial stuff, Intel and Confluent and whatnot. You kind of help scratch the itch of, I still like fundamental technology. Like it's fundamental, right? I mean, there's something to it. And so still reading stuff, still like, watch the Open AI Dev Day, right? Tinkering around, but my husband's trying to keep me as busy as possible and running around with him. So we'll see. I don't know. I don't know if this is going to be a permanent retirement or or a sabbatical kind of thing. Don't know. We'll see. But I'd love to hear, like, what are you guys most excited about in this space? If you could pick kind of one thing, what are you, for the next year ahead? What do you hope to see, or, what do you hope to, be involved with?
I'm going to make a lot go. I actually invested in all of the good ideas this year, so I'm going to take the next year off.
She's also announcing her retirement at the same time.
Half decades in, I'm done.
Yeah, she's just over with it. If you basically look at the last year, and it's only been a year since ChatGPT came out, right? And it's been a year and change since Midjourney and Stable Diffusion came out. And so I think really the last year has just been everybody waking up to the opportunity of what could happen with generative AI. I think there's been an enormous amount of investment in the foundation model side, and I still think there's lots of open questions in terms of where does that all go. But I think we know at least a handful of who the incumbents, at least in the next couple of years, will be. Maybe not forever, but at least for the next 3-4 years. You're starting to see the infrastructure side start to get filled out in different ways. And for me, the area that is still wide open is just all the various applications, both on the B2B side as well as the consumer side. And there's an enormous amount of white space there and a lot of open things to do. And so I think that's just a huge transition that's coming, both in terms of incumbents adopting AI to their existing workflows, as well as a huge chunk of the services economy being converted into code. And in this case, instead of traditional software, being converted into AI. And so I think that's probably the story of the next 2-3 years.
I'm excited about it. I'm not actually going to take the next year off. I think we're very early in the exploit cycle. Like, one of the things that has been even surprising over the last 6 months is when you are doing a lot of very new things with technology, there's a rush to try them once it has been proven. My favorite example would be like 8x8, like diffusion model image generation, and how far we have come in the last 2 years from when people said like, oh, look, this is possible. But the quality, the controllability, the usefulness of this is like not even close. And even a few months ago, like you'd have leading researchers that say like, video, like who knows if, that's a huge number of technical problems that feel unsolvable. And I think you increasingly see on the creative fronts, but many different applications, like how quickly you can get over some minimum quality that is useful, right? And it takes people who are playing with GPT-2 or like an 8x8 image to picture what quality and scale improvement can happen. But I think a lot of really smart engineers are paying attention to that now, and I think that'll accelerate the exploit cycle a lot. So it's new UI. It's a lot of, as you were talking about, latent demand. So it's not as obvious where you're not like, I'm just going to replace this existing software category. But I'm really excited that a lot of that experimentation is going to happen in a more sophisticated way at the application layer next year. And you get to like ride the capability curve too. So no retirement this next year. Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah.
Find us on Twitter at NoPriorsPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to see our faces. Follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. That way you get a new episode every week. And sign up for emails or find transcripts for every episode at no-priors.com.